Okay, again, folks, welcome to our program for today, Creating a Planned Giving Program That Works. Our presenters for this afternoon are William McMorran, who's a senior partner at Green Oak Consulting in Los Angeles, California, and Sophie Penny, who is president of I-5 Fundraising in State College, PA. Both of our presenters, this is a reprise of a session that they did, which was very well received from the members at the annual meeting in Indianapolis that was held, back in November, at the very beginning of November. So I am going to be advancing the slides for our presenters. But also, I wanted to let you know how we will be doing the question portion of our program. In the presenter area of your view, you will see a little dialog box that looks like what do you call those? A message bubble. And if you click on that, it opens up another window that it's called a conversation view, and in that you can type in your message to ask a question. So with that, I'll probably give you another cue about that as soon as we get to the question and answer portion. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn the program over to Sophie and Bill, and we will take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. This is Bill McMorran. I'm not getting, my slides are not popping up on the screen, but slide 2 is a picture of Sophie right after our presentation. And you can see we emptied the place out. It was that popular. And there's a Coke machine in the background that never worked, so it was fun to watch people. But we had a great time in Indianapolis, and what we're going to do is sort of distill this down to about an hour, less than an hour, with time for questions. The third slide, what we'll cover today, planned giving does work for all communities. The core strategies and the framework are going to be different because really there is no one-size-fits-all. There's a huge variety of organizations, a huge variety of needs, but the critical thing is, what is your community story? What's your vision? Who are your prospects? And how do you make it all work? And so in the first half, I'm going to talk about the structure and framework and analyzing what your situation is. And then Sophie is going to come in with the very practical, hardcore strategies and things that you need to do to make your program successful. So, and we have the comments for conversation. Feel free to type them in. But if we go to the next slide, which is Keys to Philanthropy Success, donative intent is the IRS standard that justifies a charitable deduction. People have to believe in the mission to make a gift. You as an organization have to put the donor's needs first, not your needs, but what they want to accomplish. You have to have full disclosure and gift explanations, and I find that engineers are the best persons to drag out all of the full disclosures from you. They start with a legal pad of about 5 pages of questions, and you whittle it down to 1 page over 6 months. And that's a successful charitable trust. And you really have to have clear needs and policies that build trust. It's a visionary thing more than a new toaster oven in the nurse's station in the skilled nursing center. So on the next slide, fundraising is not just about CCRCs. There are programs that work for market rental, that work for affordable housing. Certainly we're seeing some interesting things taking place there. Life care, rehab services, and memory care. And increasingly we're looking at how to segment the older adult market to provide more targeted and efficient messaging for planned giving, because one size doesn't fit all. If we go to the next slide, you'll see how other organizations are different in terms of fundraising than retirement housing are. Certainly with higher education, you have a large loyal pool of alumni, or hopefully you have a large loyal pool of alumni to draw on. so it's more of just metrics trying to get to everybody. In healthcare, you have grateful patients who you invite to take tours of the hospital and show them all the great things so they'll be inspired to make a significant gift. In the arts, you have galas and openings and backstage parties to attract wealthy patrons. But in retirement housing, you are different because all of us have daily contact or potential daily contact with the residents, which is unique, and it's a powerful tool, but it has to be used very carefully. On the next slide, we look at defining who you are. Are you a single site or a multi-site? A single staff person or a team? And we see sometimes where philanthropy is assigned to the executive assistant to the CEO for a half day every week. So it's amazing how philanthropy sort of gets pigeonholed into having someone who, quote, doesn't have enough to do to take care of it. Are you urban or rural or in between? A lot of times what happens is when there's one organization in the community, and it's a matter of pride for many people, and they support it because it's the only organization that takes care of them in a fairly rural area, whereas in other areas, urban areas, people don't even know what's inside the walls. Do you have other levels of care? Because, again, if we segment the market, you're going to look at different situations for giving. Do you have a history of giving or not? Are your leaders engaged in the process? And what do you really want to do? Sites matter. The next slide. With a single site, you have a clear constituency. You see your residents routinely, but again, smaller staffs have multiple tasks. And so often we see, I mentioned the administrative assistant, we see that philanthropy often comes in under marketing, and the staff are pulled in many different directions, or community services too is a popular sort of area that people get hooked into. Multi-site organizations have a larger pool, but there you're relying on a network to build more contacts, and you usually have a single focus and support to accomplish across the system. Location, 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 the next slide, is critical because what does your market look like? Is it affluent? Is it affordable? Is it somewhere in between? What does your competition look like? When you're a not-for-profit surrounded by for-profits, you have a very strong message to carry forward that sets you apart for both your marketing, and because people can make a gift to you, you have a significant message about community service. So in a competitive market, being charitable, having a philanthropy program, having a planned giving mission makes you stand out, and it becomes a very effective marketing strategy to integrate with your marketing department. And then finally, what services do you offer? If you have independent living, certainly you have a strong, healthy market appealing to individuals. If you have assisted living, SNF, rehab, or memory care, what you're really dealing with are the families. And here is where we look at market segmentation, because the more that people are grateful for the important work you're doing for your loved ones, you have a very powerful strategy to engage them in the process, similar to a healthcare situation, where they're invested because of their gratefulness and their appreciation of what you've done for their loved one. In independent living, you'll find that many people say, well, don't tell my kids, or I've talked to my kids about this, and here's what we want to do. So you have, again, a different relationship with your donors. If we go to the next slide, we put this in because it's a nice graphic. Also, it is voted by Consumer Reports the most popular and best tasting grill chain, hamburger chain in America, the Habit Burger Grill. And the reason we put it there, not only is it a good graphic, but people like hamburgers and becomes a habit. And as we go to the next slide, is your giving habitual? And right now, I'm sure all of you are up to your ears in the holiday staff gift program. Is there anything that goes on besides that in your community, or is that the focus that pushes everything else aside? Are there supports for other community charities? Historically, we saw where people came into communities with a focus on the charities in the larger community, and getting them to think about their own community where they live has been a difficult task. is there board giving or outside support? Outside support's tough. Board giving is tough too. It's hard to get 100% participation in your board. It is, some boards don't even want to give. They're sort of there because, yeah, somebody asked us, or we like old people. It's hard. Boards sometimes will reject programs because they did not want to be asked. And in other areas, you'll see outside support being important. South, particularly in the southern regions, you have church groups, religious groups that support communities. In other cases, I mentioned rural communities because it's their one main provider. The community will be supported. So there's a variety of outside support and board issues to consider. But the critical question is, do residents trust you? If they don't trust you, if they're not comfortable with the leadership, it's very hard to do fundraising because you want people to believe in your mission first, and plan giving follows from that belief in mission. So if you have an executive director who's afraid to come out of his or her office to talk to people, you may have a problem developing a plan giving program. Very important to have your leadership engaged and to build trust with your residents, because that's the key to successful plan giving. We look at the next slide. What are your key messages regardless, whether it's habitual, what your market is? The key messages are, how does a gift impact your mission? Because we're not talking about a donation for a bench. We're not talking to a donation for the staff. We're talking about a vision that is beyond the individual. So it has to be a message of gifting that has significance, that can be explained how the gift would be used. For example, we want to have an endowment fund for the chaplaincy program. That's a very clear message. It has a lot of different elements around it. It also has a feature that people want to support. Finding that right message is critical. How can a donor make a difference? That's important. You may have seen just recently, there's been several articles about the ineffectiveness of saying 10 million people go to bed hungry every night, we want to help them. And having these giant vision things is not as efficient as having people say 1 in 6 Americans are hungry, and we need to have a very steady program here in our community to help those who live with us. Different type of messaging. So you want to have a message that is clear about how the gift would be used and how the donor can make how the donor can make a difference. And finally, do you have a compelling case to make the message? Then we have what we call the plan giving pivot. Once you have a message, you talk about how your donors can endow the future. You talk about how your donors can create a legacy. The community will continue to serve, and your community will benefit. These are very powerful words that you want to use to engage that vision to your potential plan giving donors. The next slide, it's an easy starting point. 80% of all gifts are bequests. Remember, it's in your will or living trust. Clear messaging for all of the communities. Clearly, the IRA Qualified Charitable Distribution Program is a powerful tool that you need to get out steadily. It's kind of running out for this year, but it's now permanent. But I've been surprised how few people really know about this. But it's a great way to have a steady messaging about giving, and it also opens the door to more significant plan giving messages that you can communicate over time. So there are ways to make gifts. This can be an easy starting point is bequests in affordable housing. If you're familiar with transfer on death or beneficiary designation, even though people are of very limited income in affordable housing, they can leave a portion of whatever's in their checking account to you as a beneficiary or a transfer on death. They can leave a portion of their pension fund or anything they receive. I don't recommend them giving you savings bonds because they're messy, but what you can do is have very simple messaging to all levels about creative strategies. And then the reality of bequests is that you only know maybe 25 to 30% of all of the people who've included you in their estate plans. And sometimes all you end up doing is opening the mail and finding out that a donor has left you a significant gift that you hadn't realized, and you'd never been able to talk to them about it while they were living. And so opening the mail is important, but getting out with your message is even more important, saying, this is where we create legacy societies as a message to engage people in telling you what's happened, even if they don't want to. Oftentimes they will become engaged through a legacy society where your odds of knowing the number of trusts out increase to about 50% of all of the bequests being intended rather than 30%. As we go to the next slide, more complex opportunities, ways to minimize capital gains, and we're going to look at a slide in a moment that shows a very specific illustration of that. We talk about how people can boost their income through a charitable gift annuity, through a charitable remainder trust. You can talk about how people can benefit their heirs by doing a charitable trust that could run beyond their lifetime. As I shared in Indianapolis, a couple who had lived in Omaha, Nebraska, had bought a share of Berkshire Hathaway Class A for about $1,000, and at the time it was worth about $180,000 per share. What we did was we put that into a charitable remainder unit. In meaningful fashion. So there's lots of good things to do around that. And then the final slide, resolving IRA tax issues, is important. I mentioned the qualified charitable distribution program, but also having someone has an IRA and names you as a beneficiary of that IRA, they can avoid a lot of taxation in their final tax return. All of that income, if it were to go to their trust, to their living trust, or to their heirs, would bear a taxable stamp. It would be very heavily taxed. By naming you as a beneficiary of it, they can reduce that tax exposure, and that's a whole other hour of beautiful tax-saving strategies. But if we go to the next slide, which is a sale and unit trust, I talked about market segmenting. We are very focused right now on market segmenting of CCRC entry programs. For example, right now we're closing a trust tomorrow where it is people who have been waiting to move into a retirement community that was being built. We talked to them about capital gains issues 6 to 8 months ago and selling their home in finding assets to sell with capital gains attached to make the entry fee. So we're closing some trusts around ways to minimize capital gain exposure in selling your home. We're doing that similar seminar for individuals where you have a community, and what we're seeing in all the communities, the more rapid turnover, the shorter and shorter length of stay in independent living. It used to be 10 years. Aging in place is not an issue we hear about so much as we used to, because people are coming in later and they're staying less time in independent living. So we have an ongoing educational program about considering moving into our community. Here are the tax things to think about. Here are some strategies to help you figure out how to make it work on a financial side. Saying, when someone moves from 5,000 square feet down to 2,000 square feet of space, you have people who go out and help them organize their stuff, what to take, what not to take, what to send to Goodwill. Similarly, we see this very helpful in terms of organizing and understanding cash flow and tax considerations in organizing that move. And then finally, where you're planning a new community, we're doing programs just to educate people about the tax process and things to consider in planning. So that is where I am going to hand it off to Sophie, who is going to talk about the key things that you do and the hard part. So thank you, and Sophie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Can everybody hear me? Jennifer and Bill, do you hear me?
I do.
Hello?
Yeah, I do as well. I was on mute.
I'm just assuming you hear me, so I'm going to keep going. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to make you aware that when you saw the I-5 fundraising, you're wondering maybe why I'm doing this. So I did spend the last 7 years working for a continuing care retirement community as their first ever development director. launching their fundraising program and focusing a great deal on planned giving. So I've been on the ground in doing this work and look forward to just sharing some thoughts and ideas for you. So one of the very first things I think is really critical, if you haven't done this yet within your organization, is making sure that you have policies and procedures in place. Very critical that you have a gift acceptance policy. There are some really wonderful examples that are available out on the web. There is an individual by the name of Catherine Miree, M-I-R-E-E, who has done some great work around this topic. Through what used to be known as the Partnership on Philanthropic Planning, they've now changed their name. I believe it's a group that does, I'll have to find out the name and have Jennifer send it to you and send a link to their website. But it's a great group that does tremendous work. And they have lots of very good information about gift acceptance policies. It's important that those policies cover different types of planned gifts. And that people understand the procedures for dealing with them. Because as Bill pointed out, while most gifts are bequests, there are many other kinds of gifts that people might give to you, and your organization wants to be prepared to receive them when the time comes that someone sends one to you. You do also want to think about maybe a gift counting policy. If you are in a CCRC or in a setting where all of your prospects are, say, over 65, this is not as important as if you're in an organization that maybe serves people of a number of different ages, or where you're maybe marketing planned gifts to people who are under 65 years old. The reason I bring this up is because you have to think about the current value or the present value of a gift. If somebody is only 60 or 55 today, the present value of a gift that's a bequest that might not come until they're 80 is really not nearly as high as if you're getting a bequest from someone who's, or a bequest commitment from somebody who's 80 years old and has a maybe current life expectancy of 5 more years. So if you are actually booking planned gifts, you need to be thinking about gift counting. Endowed funds policy is critical. One of the first things I put into place with organizations if they think they're going to have any endowed funds. It's really critical to outline different kinds of endowed funds because there are different types. So you can have anything from what might be a traditional endowed fund that those of you who have worked in colleges and universities are familiar with, where the money is set aside in perpetuity and only the income or a portion of the income is used annually, maybe 5%. But there are other types of endowed funds, some of which are spend-down funds. We call quasi-endowed funds are ones where it's sort of a spend-down fund, but you also you can invade the principal if you want, or you can let that principal sit there for a long time. But you have the flexibility to go either direction. And again, an organization needs to have these conversations because, as Bill pointed out, donors need to know where their money is going, how it will be used. For example, when I was at Foxdale Village in State College, Pennsylvania, a Quaker-directed continuing care retirement community, all of our funds were quasi-endowed funds. That meant that we would not necessarily invade principal, but we could. So we had a training and tuition fund for staff that had $725,000 in it initially, thanks to some anonymous donors who created a trust and left that money to the organization upon their death. We were able to spend as much or as little of that on an annual basis as we wanted. The upside to having a fund like that is if you are spending it down, and you're spending it well, and you have great stories to tell, you can encourage people to make additional gifts and build the fund. Bill referred to legacy societies. I will say this. I think that legacy societies work in some places and not others. I think your organization, as Bill said, every organization is different. You need to have the conversation. The organization that I worked for, donors were not necessarily driven by being public about their philanthropy. It was a very small community. Whereas there may be larger organizations or organizations of a different culture where a legacy society will do, as Bill said, help you to uncover gifts and help you to encourage additional gifts. Those of us who are fundraisers know people often want to give and be like their peers. are encouraged by their peers doing something. So if they see a peer's name on a Legacy Society board, they may say, wow, if that person did this, I might want to as well. Let's go to the next slide, Jennifer. Okay, so some additional things you need to think about. You need to make sure that you have a gift agreement in place that will work for a donor, particularly if you're creating a specific fund or purpose for the use of their gift. So, for example, when I was at Foxdale, a donor approached us who wanted to create a fund specifically to support outreach to elders in the broader community. So we had to create an agreement with that donor that outlined the terms of what the focus of the expenditures would be. We had to determine who, in fact, had authority to determine how the money would be spent and other things like that. So if you haven't created gift agreements, again, there are samples out there, and it's important to make sure that you put those things in place. As Bill pointed out, there are lots of different kinds of gifts to offer. Marketing bequests is the #1 thing to do because it's simple and easy to do. So you may need to make sure you tell people that there are 3 ways to leave a bequest. They can leave you a specific dollar amount, they can leave a percentage of their estate to you, or they can leave the residuum of their estate. And I will say that in the 7 years that I was at Foxdale, I saw all 3 types. And all 3 types had different benefits, and we saw planned gifts, bequests of all sizes. It's important to share that message because people don't necessarily know that. Bill mentioned beneficiary gifts. I think it's important as you educate your prospective donors to make it clear to them that one of the benefits of doing beneficiary gifts, but they also need to keep the potential sort of downside in mind, is that beneficiary gifts trump wills. People don't often realize that beneficiary gifts are the first to be paid out, and they don't necessarily look at their estate plan as a whole. And so they don't necessarily realize that if I give that money out of my IRA to Foxdale or your community, but I really want my children to share equally in my estate, I've just taken that money I've sent as a beneficiary designation out of that money that I would count to give to my children. So this is an educational piece you need to be sure you're talking to people about. Gift annuities and trusts. It is possible for some organizations to have a third party that will insure gift annuities and manage programs for you. When I was at Foxdale, we used a company by the name of Everance, EVERANCE, which is affiliated with the Mennonite Mutual Foundation. They serve peace churches. Everance is a large financial services firm that's faith-based and was able to provide a gift annuity program for us. They did all of the management. They invested the money. They sent out all the tax documents. And really the agreement was between the donor and that person, but then we would receive the income when the donor passed away. I won't go into trusts at length, but as I mentioned already, Foxdale benefited from people having left Foxdale in trusts, and there are people who have that capacity, particularly if you're in a CCRC that's a full pay community. Bill's mentioned the IRA, QDC. It's a tremendous opportunity for people. I'm working with a small nonprofit right now that has a donor who's using this to make gifts to the organization. And there's some great material out there. I can, again, provide a reference for Jennifer. Real estate and retained life estates can work particularly if people have second homes. So that's something to be thinking about if you have donors who might be in that set of circumstance. There sometimes are difficult to value gifts. Those are things you need to think about with your gift acceptance policy and decide whether you want to be able to accept them or not. Many organizations will not because they're simply too complicated and costly. But I think if I'm right, that's something that Bill can help you with. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So I am very focused and have been on how you market plan gifts. And so who do you talk to? Who do you speak with? As Bill said, part of this depends on who you are, where you are, who your prospects are. Obviously, if you have residents or prospective residents, and you have individuals who have the capacity to pay your fees, they are individuals who would be people to consider marketing plan gifts to. Family members in some cases are also individuals who might be thinking about that, particularly if you have a marketing program that has a sort of legacy focus to it. As next generations are preparing to move into CCRCs, you have a really perfect case with someone whose maybe mother or father has lived in that CCRC and been cared for tremendously well, and they plan to move in or maybe already have moved in to talk about how they as a family can leave a legacy. And it might be possible, if both family members are still living, to receive a family legacy gift. As Bill mentioned, grateful patients. Some of you have short-term rehab, or maybe people who aren't staying with you over the long run for other reasons. And, hospitals are doing great work on this front, and terrific examples of being able to reach out to grateful patients. I think as well, too, it's really critical to reach out to estate, legal, financial, and other planners, including, I would argue, funeral planners. Because sometimes when people are writing that obituary, if they're pre-planning, they're thinking about who do I mention in my obituary. So they might be actually having this conversation with their funeral planner. But one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from the former director of our community foundation in our area was go and meet advisors, estate, legal, and financial, so that they're aware when they're talking to their clients who might live or want to benefit your community, that you accept estate gifts, what kinds you accept, what kinds of programs people can direct their money to, so that they can advise their clients well and hopefully maybe even bring up the idea. Let's move on to the next slide, Jennifer. So what's the message? First of all, when you're messaging as you do about all fundraising, it's not about you. It's not all about your organization. Certainly you want to talk about the great work you've done and how people can benefit and further that work. But really the main message should be about your donors. What do they care about? What are their values? If you have a faith-based community that has very specific kinds of values that attracts people, I think you have a wonderful opportunity to talk about those values and to ask donors about what they value and what's important to them, and make a connection between their values and yours, and use that as an opportunity to ask them if they want to help further those values over the long run after they're no longer here, and ensure that those values continue to be instilled for future generations of people who live in your community. I think all of us know this as fundraisers, but it doesn't go without saying that this is about relationships between you and others, the family, other nonprofits, the donor with your organization. And keep in mind, I mentioned other nonprofits because when people are planning, they're not necessarily planning just for your organization. Often we have people who are generous across our communities, and we need to be upfront and acknowledge that we realize that we may not be the only organization they want to benefit, but we're happy to talk with them about how they could potentially benefit multiple organizations. Let's go on to the next slide. So I think it's important to acknowledge planning as you're talking with people as a healthy practice that's beneficial to the donor. There's a wonderful book that I recommend to people called How to Say It to Seniors. And this book, while I'm not a fan of the title necessarily, what I am a fan of is the premise that the author puts forward, that planning and thinking about bringing one's life to closure and their legacy, and thinking about your legacy, is the final developmental stage of life. And I think that as development officers, this is purely my perspective, but I feel that I have an obligation, and I feel that I have a commitment to wanting people to have their end of life be as rich and as beneficial a process to them as possible. And I think that helping them think about their values and what their legacy might be is one of the greatest things I can do as a fundraiser for those I'm working with. I think that going through a process of thinking about making a plan gift can help people define and communicate their values. I'm trained to help people write what's called an ethical will. That's just one way, or a legacy letter, it's just one way of helping people think about their values and what's been important and why, and who and how they might want to benefit people through a legacy plan. But even just the conversation or a set of conversations that happen over time can achieve that goal. I think it's also really critical that you remind people that to the degree they are able and willing, given their family and other circumstances, that they make sure they share their plans with people, keeping in mind that no one will be able to understand their intent or why they chose to do what they did after they pass away, because they're not here to communicate that. So we did encourage people, again, given the parameters they live in, to share. So let's move on. So I talked about focusing on the donor. I think it's important to talk about the mission and vision of your organization. Hopefully you have a strategic plan or are in the process of getting ready to have one. I think it's really important to talk to people about what the goals of your organization are now and what the vision for the future is. And it's very critical. Again, that former foundation head here in our community said, he served on our development committee for the 7 years I was at the organization. Tell the story, tell the story, tell the story. It's just really critical when you're sending out newsletters or if you have stories about plan giving, to talk about how those gifts benefited people. We, in our cover letters that often went with our newsletter, and I did put a cover letter on every newsletter that we sent. I didn't do a trifold that was a self-mailer. We had a story or two stories, and every single one is a sidebar about how gifts benefited people in our organization, and we certainly also put those in our newsletter. So it's really important to share that impact. Also for our employee program, we would occasionally have employees get up at the resident meeting, or once a year, the CEO would have me do a presentation about philanthropy. If I could, I would invite somebody on the staff who benefited from that training and tuition fund to come and talk about how that benefited them. That is where people are really inspired to make a difference. So let's move on. So marketing. Estate planning programs are something that I instituted very early in my tenure at Foxdale. We initially did them quarterly. I brought in advisors, external folks from the community. I usually did a panel. I didn't want to seem as though I was focusing on only one organization or giving them a platform to sell themselves. So I actually created a one-pager with parameters for the presenters that I would share with them and actually discuss with them in person before I would agree to put them on a panel. But I would pick people for different areas of expertise. I looked at CPAs, financial planners, attorneys, people who really, if you put all three of those or more on a panel, presented what really was the estate planning team that somebody should be using to create their plan. And so we would have them talk about everything from things like when the estate planning, estate taxes are changing a lot, so how are those things changing, to we brought a minister, a psychologist, and myself did a program about how to tie up loose ends. How do you think about your legacy? How do you talk with your family as you're reaching the end of life? And how does that tie back to thinking about your estate plan? Using brochures and booklets, you can create them in-house, and we did. But then we did start, before I left, start talking with vendors. There are lots of them who can provide materials that you can put your logo on and those sorts of things that are very good and get into details. And if you're a small shop, they can be very helpful. Using newsletters, even some organizations, I've gone to some great programs where universities, for example, are using social media and have groups for plan giving people to talk about different ways to make plan gifts. Let's move forward now. So this is just one example of a program that we had. We had a number of residents who asked us. They had family members who had special needs. So we brought some people in. You can see down there on the right who the kinds of presenters were and what their expertise was. So this was one that I knew was going to draw a small group, but really critically important for that group of people. So again, I'm making it clear that this wasn't always just about us or making a planned gift. We were trying to help people bring their own plans to closure for others. And I think they really appreciated that. And I think that can help cement plan giving because people know you're not just about making a gift to you. Let's move on. So obviously, talking on a personal level is the best way to go, though I will say that I've closed plan gifts with people online by their choice. You know, where they've sent very detailed emails, which I quite honestly was grateful for because I could put them into my donor system and I had all of the documentation I needed literally coming straight from the person about what their intent was. But obviously, talking directly with people is the best way to go. It creates trusting relationships and helps you talk about different options. It also gives an opportunity to potentially bring in planners or partners or family members if needed and appropriate. I think, you know, always the mantra, and I think those of you who've been in this know this, it's patience plus persistence. Probably who we really need to share that mantra with and get to, you know, sort of sit and be zen about it are probably our EDs and our board members and maybe our committee members. Who are wondering where the money is today. We have to remind people that plan giving is a long-term process and it takes a lot of time and we have to wait because often these gifts aren't coming until somebody passes. So let's go on. So listen when you're talking to people about things like them wanting to avoid taxes, needing more cash. And I will say, let me just go back to that first one for a minute. When I was marketing a particular plan giving program, I didn't use that terminology, and I read an article about the fact that avoiding taxes is a real trigger for people to want information. So we changed the language in the announcement, and we had people signing up very quickly, almost in droves for the program. So using that term can be very powerful. The need for more cash, obviously for some people, having low CD and other return rates, reminding them right now lots of people have highly appreciated stock. This is a great time to be getting out the message that if they have highly appreciated stock, to use it to make a legacy gift. To have the security of fixed payments if they're talking about an annuity of some kind, either a charitable gift annuity or a charitable trust that's an annuitized trust. And continuing revenue for a spouse and doing that fairly easily. So let's go on to the next one. A few more tips. You need to just keep sending out the message and being persistent. You never know. There's usually some trigger for action. You don't necessarily know what it is. It may be, unfortunately, the passing of a child who was an heir, or someone else, or some other life event that causes a person to act, and you can't predict when that will come. But your messages can make a difference. And the next one. So how do you track your progress? As Bill said, you might know only about 30 or 50%. A legacy society might help with that. I do suggest at least tracking the conversations, and if you do have expectancies, to put them in there, to put them in your database, but also make sure that you're sharing that information with your FO. So she or he is aware of potential expected gifts that might come into the organization. And in some cases, if those gifts have been booked and the donor's of a certain age, the FO does want to put those on to their spreadsheets and to be tracking those actively. Next. Okay, so the success is about the donor, your vision and mission. We talked about patience and persistence. I know because I was in a CCRC environment, I had many hall conversations. It's often how I had some discussions and meaningful ones about people with gifts. Sometimes it was just they stopped me and asked me to send them information about how to put the organization in their will. As Bill said earlier, sometimes it's just opening the mail. You get the letter from the attorney providing you the great news that you're the beneficiary of a bequest, or maybe you've gotten an IRA gift or a 403B gift, and getting on the phone and talking with people. Next. And I've provided some references and resources. There is that How to Say It to Seniors book that I referred to, some info about effective gift acceptance policies, It is the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners, which was formerly PPP. A couple of other resources. I think the next slide may be just our question slide. Yes, so now we're open to your questions.
Well, we've already had one question. What is an FO? And I tried to answer it as saying it's a fundraising office or officer, but I am not sure if I was correct.
No, I'm sorry. I mean a chief financial officer.
Oh,
so
CFO.
Financial officer for your organization. People have different titles for them, but it's the person who's managing the finances of the organization.
Yeah, and could I add something there too? What I've found more and more is that CFOs see numbers. They don't see conceptual endowment legacy. They see numbers. And so you have to translate for them the language of how this makes dollars and cents to them, as well as minimizing any risk exposure to the organization. And that's where your policies come into place. That's why past performance, saying, look at how much we've raised and what we can really accomplish, can be very effective. And this is a terrible thing to say, but some people call them CFNOs rather than CFOs.
Other questions?
I don't. Okay, let's see. Okay, I don't have any other questions. Is anyone else trying to at least type in a question? Well, I don't see anything.
Jennifer?
Yes.
I think there may be one more slide that might have our contact information on it.
Yes, hold on. There it is.
Okay, so if anybody wants to get in touch with either Bill or myself offline, off of the program, please feel free to shoot us an email or give one of us a call.
Yep, happy to talk.
And in the meantime, folks, please have a happy and healthy holiday season, and we'll be back in the first quarter of 2017 with another Lunch and Learn. And if I do say so myself, it wasn't, totally smooth, but I think this webinar platform will work in the end as soon as we get all the kinks out of it. So hopefully we found a solution. So everyone, thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye all.
Great. Thanks.
Bye.
Have a good holiday.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Nobody asked any questions? End meeting.